Hello, insiders, and welcome to this new episode of the EU Bubble Insider. Our guest today is Craig Winneker, the Communications Director at ePURE. Craig, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Shishtoff. Thanks a lot.
Craig, maybe we could start by explaining our listeners what ePURE does and a bit more about your role as the Communications Director there.
Sure. ePURE, it's another one of those great EU acronyms that no one knows what it means, but it's we're the European Renewable Ethanol Association, so we're the trade association that represents EU producers of renewable ethanol, which is basically alcohol, but it's used mainly for fuel, but other applications, beverage, industrial, chemical, hand sanitizer, that sort of thing, all produced from agricultural crops, wastes, and residues from Europe. So it's the domestic industry. So we represent about 42 member companies and associations, including producers all around Europe of renewable ethanol. And so we're involved in a lot of different, well, mainly transport, energy, and climate, but also agriculture, trade, a lot of different policy areas. And as comms director, and also actually we're a small association. There's only six of us, so I'm actually the comms team in addition to being the comms director. I'm in charge of all the communication strategy, messaging, content, media relations, so dealing with the journalists, um, ensuring that we get our key points across so that my colleagues who are working more on the government affairs and advocacy side can more effectively get their do their work because we have clear messages that advance our policy aims.
So it sounds like you're really in the business of explaining sophisticated, complex issues in words, in simple words that help
That
people understand what your industry actually deals with.
that's exactly it. I mean, it's interesting because a lot of my career, I spent most of my career as a journalist. I've worked both as a journalist and in PR and communications, but actually a lot when I was a journalist, I was writing and reporting, but I was also mainly an editor, and I was doing the same thing in those roles as I do in this role and in other PR and comms roles that I've had, which is taking very complex material and turning it into something people can understand and that's meaningful and that resonates with them. And in our case, is also trying to advance a certain policy point of view and getting a certain target audience to react or act in a certain way. But the crux of it for me is I'm taking whether it's a complicated position paper or policy, a list of policy recommendations or series of messages that we want to get across, based on an industry that's all well, mostly scientists and agricultural chemists and things like that, and turning it into something that's compelling for normal people. And even, people say, oh, you work in the EU bubble and it's everyone here is like really into policy and knows everything. That may be true, but not everyone knows everything about every policy, and not everyone has the brain space to be completely up on all the technical details of everything. Um, so you have to be able to reach, especially if you're talking about MEPs, for example, in the European Parliament. They can't know everything about everything. You have to be really clear and simple. And even people who are experts, quite frankly, they want to read things that are nice to read and easy to understand. They don't want to have to like use extra brain power to decode what a message is. So for me, that's a big part of my job is taking this complicated stuff and making it compelling and interesting.
And when approaching MEPs with messages about topics like ethanol and related issues, how much do you have to get into drawing the context, explaining the background to actually be possible to speak about the specific topic you're coming with?
Uh, that's a really good question. I mean, always, people say politics, everything in politics is local, so you always need to come you try to put it, if you're speaking directly to a certain group of politicians, you want to talk about how your industry is helping their constituency or their country or their region or what have you, or a certain social sector. And in our case, we're also trying to make the case that there's a strategic importance to having domestic production of renewable ethanol, um, not just for climate, like reducing the use of fossil fuel. The ethanol that we produce, it replaces fossil fuel in cars, the cars that people are driving. So it's already reducing emissions from road transport. That's important to tell people, but it's also important to say, well, this provides a market for your farmers. Um, it's producing, in addition to the fuel, we're also producing food and animal feed along at the same time. So you get both products out of the production process. So we're contributing to food security. So you try to make all of these points. The other challenge, of course, and this is true for I think a lot of different um, sectors in the EU, is you have to also counteract some of the misinformation and myths that are out there of people who are against your position or trying to make a different argument. And so, in our case, um, we're playing offense and defense at the same time, making a positive case for our industry and showing how it contributes to achieving important European goals of reducing emissions, fighting against climate change, boosting food security, energy independence, all of these things, strategic autonomy, being having Europe more reliant on its own resources. But we also have to play defense and push back against some of the attacks. And in our case, some of those have been quite virulent and difficult to deal with. So that's a big part of the challenge.
You mentioned that you had this previous experience of working as a journalist before you actually got into comms and public affairs. And I analyzed your career on LinkedIn, and you actually had some back and forth changes from journalism to public affairs and communications. How does this help you doing your job well today? This quite unusual broad experience from both sides.
Yeah, it helps a lot, actually. I mean, it's interesting because people say they used to say to journalists, "Oh, if you go over into PR, or leave journalism and go into public affairs or communications, you can't come back. You've crossed the Rubicon or whatever." And in my case, I not only did it once, but I did it twice. And it was a bit unusual circumstance because I had the first time I left because I wanted to stay in Brussels, and there weren't a lot of opportunities in journalism, and I decided to get into communications and had some great experience doing it. But when Politico was starting up here in Brussels in 2015, I think, a lot of the people who were involved in that knew I was here, and I had worked with them, and so they saw me as an asset, and that's how I kind of got back into that. But to get to your question, it helps a lot in a couple of ways. One, I have good connections with a lot of people in the media world and journalists in town. I get along with them. I know, uh, because I was on the receiving end of a lot of PR for most of my career. I know what journalists like and don't like, especially what they don't like. They don't like getting bombarded with a lot of stuff that has nothing to do with their beat, which uh, a lot, doesn't stop a lot of PR people from doing that. They like someone who understands what they're covering and what they're interested in, and can help feed that with information and being reliable and swift and all of those things. So I understand when a journalist comes to me with a question, for example. um, I get back very quickly, sometimes immediately, whereas I think a lot of associations, you'd have, at least it used to be, you'd have a lot of runaround of trying to figure out, do we even want to talk to this person? For me, it's, I'm quite happy to engage in that way. The other angle is, I understand what makes a news story and what's interesting about, how to sell, how to pitch an idea or a concept in a way that looks newsy or is newsy. I know I'm not going to send out a press release that has 10 paragraphs of background before I get to the what the actual news is. And to be fair, when I was an editor working in journalism, sometimes I would be editing stories where you had the same problem. I'd have to go to the 10th paragraph to find what the news is. So it's a problem a lot of people have, but it's one that I think one of my things that I bring to the role is if a journalist is getting information from me, they're going to be getting, short, succinct, and clear. Here's what the message is. Here's the data behind it. If you need more information, contact me. There's that kind of relationship. So it really helps me a lot. And I think it helps on the other side, working in communications. I have the journalist mindset. So if I'm in a meeting and we're having a discussion about, or um, some kind of agreement, trying to reach an agreement on something, I'm there asking what questions a journalist would ask. What are we really trying to say here? Cut through the BS. What is the news? Let's not worry about all the extraneous material, and also being a little bit skeptical of things. So if I think that's another reflex that journalists have, or they should have, being skeptical and asking questions and not just taking the first answer to anything. So for me, it's you know, what's the deal behind that? Are you sure about that? Is that really true? And I have that. I feel like I have that bullshit detector, as we say, that I find quite helpful in my role.
I think this is great advice. I personally have the experience of someone telling me, "Let's not get back to that journalist too quickly, so they don't feel that we really want them to write about us," which
Yeah.
um,
Well,
is
in
just
that
not.
case, there may be. I mean, for me, I will almost always get back. I may get back to a journalist simply to say, I need to check on that, or I need to get more information about that. What's your deadline? But I don't leave them hanging. I mean, for me, as a journalist, if you feel like you're asking questions into the void, and someone is playing games with you on the other side, that's not going to be good. So I'd rather have an honest relationship. And it may be that I'm not going to have a comment, or I'm not going to have any information to give, but at least I've been upfront and said, look, I've tried, or I checked and we're not going to say anything about that, or whatever. But and the answer is quick. The journalist isn't waiting around. They're on 5 different deadlines. They need to know. And if you're jerking them around, you're not making it's not going to be helpful. The next time you need them for something, you're going to be seen as someone who's not trustworthy.
I couldn't agree more. So to get a little bit of a peek into your way of working, could you walk us through a typical day? You said your team is not big, so I assume there's a lot of jumping from one task to another, from different types of tasks. How does your let's say ideal good day look like at work, and what tools do you use to make it more efficient?
Well, first tool of any good day would be coffee. I think that goes without saying. Starts my day. But no, I kind of divide. I mean, I don't have a set. I wouldn't say I have a typical day, but I have certain things that I do every day that fit into certain categories. I'd say that I start the day kind of in a monitoring phase, where I'm looking for stories. We kind of do a daily summary of the news for members. It's not a big major production or anything, but it's like, okay, I might spend the first half an hour at work saying, what are the headlines? What's happened? I check all the different news sources. I get all the morning newsletters. I have a couple of different services that are monitoring things for me and sending me, clips and stories. And I kind of say, okay, here are the 5 or 6 most important things that our members need to know. And I shoot out a little, you couldn't even call it a newsletter, just kind of a mini email with a summary of those and links. And it's quite helpful for me too, because it shows me every day, what the landscape is out there. Um, and then I'd say, so that would be kind of the morning. And then a bit later, there's usual, the day is going to have usually some kind of meeting with a working group of members, whether it's communications working group or government affairs, or we're involved with a lot of different alliances of different other associations, which are often having meetings. So there might be 1 or 2 of those. I would lump that kind of thing into a second category of thing that I'm working on, which would be like messaging, or what how are we advancing our messages, or the the policy ideas that we want to get across, or how are we putting together coalitions or advancing our interests. And that's so that's another part of the day. And then, yeah, I guess, there's always a social media aspect as well, where I'm doing some, whether it's posting on LinkedIn or uh, Twitter/X, some messaging there to get out some of the things. Okay, here's what's the big story of the day. We need to say this, this, and this about it. Um, and I don't, I'm probably unlike a lot of other associations. I'm a little bit more ad hoc about that. I know a lot of people have, they might have an Excel spreadsheet with, okay, we're going to send this tweet here, we're going to send this tweet on this day at this time, and I'm a bit more like, I kind of go when, I'm a little bit more reactive in certain ways. I'm monitoring all the time, so I'm answering back to criticism or replying to posts that need some kind of message from us. I'm doing that a little bit on the fly, um, and I'm lucky because I have some freedom to do that. I don't generally don't have to run my things that I publish, whether it's something on the website or something on social media. I don't have to run it by a whole team of people. I've sort of put together. This may be something we want to talk about. I've made sure to try and align messaging beforehand so that it gives me carte blanche to then be much more proactive and reactive at the same time, getting messages out. So I don't have to send a press release 2 days after something happens. I don't have to respond to a tweet the next day. I can respond 15 minutes later or whatever, because I'm just doing it. Um,
And now I have a question
yeah,
that I think I'm asking on behalf of many comms people in the EU
yeah,
bubble, and probably not only. How do you work out a position like that for yourself and your organization, that the people who you report to, your bosses,
yeah.
trust you enough to give you this freedom, which I think we both can agree is very helpful in doing your job well.
Yeah, and that's a really good question, and I understand that it's not a given for a lot of associations. And I know I know that if I worked for Coca-Cola or something, I wouldn't have that same freedom. Part of it comes from, I'm working in an association where we have built up over the years quite a good um, set of working groups with members. And even though the members are all different companies and they have different business interests and everything, they pretty much agree on what the general how what the industry is up against, and how it needs to respond, and what its strategy needs to be. So or at least, there's not a lot of infighting. I have worked in associations where there was members pushing against each other, and you had to tread a very fine line. That's quite difficult. But in my current case, that's not really the case. There are occasionally disagreements among members, but mostly we agree and we can move forward. So then I can make sure that in constant communication with members, we've laid out, and I usually do this. Um, People use the word narrative, and it's one of those things where it's another word that's come to mean bullshit, I think. But for me, I kind of find it useful as an internal thing. Like, I wouldn't sell a narrative externally by saying, "Hey, here's our narrative." For me, it's more of like an internal Bible, that we create. We say, "Okay, this is our main storyline or main messages that we want to get across. Here are the 3 or 4 or 5 key messages, the data and fact points behind it, uh, key lines of argument or quotes that we can use. Not a script, but like I say, a kind of guiding text." And I get members to agree that, and I say, I'm going to be able to use this now. It's not 100% foolproof. There's occasionally a time or a sensitive issue where you need to be a bit more careful. But for me, it's the value of of acting quickly and being responsive to media inquiries or to attacks from groups that are lobbying and against you or making accusations against our industry. We need to be able to respond quickly, and I think our members have appreciated that, and so I've been quite lucky that I've been given that free reign, as it were.
Could you walk us through uh, one or two campaigns that you're most proud of? How you approached and how what was actually the key success point that made it work out well for ePURE?
We had a campaign, I'd say in the last year and a half or so. Well, I guess starting almost 2 years ago, when the sort of big European climate package Fit for 55 came out, the renewable ethanol industry and the whole biofuels industry really was in a bit of an existential situation. And it wasn't the first time. I've worked at ePURE for 6 years now. It was sort of the second time this happened, but so we had a clear threat posed to the industry, and also a kind of a way that we would try and make positive arguments to preserve our role, the industry's role in contributing to climate change mitigation and GHG reduction, and showing that, look, people are still going to be driving petrol and hybrid cars for a long time. You need to take the fossil fuel out of those cars and replace it with something renewable, etc. But there was quite a concerted effort on the part of some uh, lobby groups, like environmental lobby groups. I won't name any names, but they were getting rather well funded from foundations, and even from some governments, and even from the European Commission, actually, which is quite shocking, to lobby specifically against biofuels. And so we had, and we're making some, spreading a lot of misinformation, making a lot of attacks, even calling our industry immoral and illegal, things like this. So we had a lot coming at us, and we also had to make this case in a positive way for the continued existence of the industry and the continued role that it should have. So we put together a campaign. It ended up being called Mind the Gap. I've noticed we didn't make it up, obviously, but I've noticed in the last 2 years a couple of other campaigns that have been called Mind the Gap. So I think maybe it's outlived its usefulness now. But the idea was that we were saying, look, if biofuels have to meet a certain level of sustainability criteria in the EU to be used. We meet those, and we're the number one renewable energy source in transport. If you eliminate biofuels, you are creating a gap that can only be filled by fossil fuel. So basically, if you argue against biofuels, you may you may be pushing for alternatives like electric vehicles uh, and such things, which we didn't argue against. Those things are fine, but they're not here yet in a massive way. You're going to leave a huge gap for fossil fuel, and so then we use that as a way to say, mind that gap. Don't have that. Don't leave that gap. We can replace fossil fuel in a way, and we can do it sustainably. We tried to do it we tried to have a campaign to use some tactics that some of our opponents would use, a little bit more uh, guerrilla style, I would say. Uh, and we used an agency that worked for us, and they did great work. And we worked in concert with them on the key messages and everything. But they had some ideas for things where we did some not quite demonstrations, but we had a sort of 3D trompe-l'oeil carpet that we put in front of the European Parliament that made it look like there was a giant hole in the ground, essentially, that was being, if you looked at it in a certain way. And then people, came up and were interacting with this thing because it was quite cool to look at, and you could stand on it and take pictures, and it looked like you were standing over a kind of yawning chasm that was being filled with fossil fuel. And we made some videos around that. We also did some things like sending puzzle piece games to MEPs that had again, that same image of a sort of giant gap being left that fossil fuel would fill. Um, so those were a little bit different, nothing revolutionary, but quite different for the usual trade association thing of we have a a dedicated website, or we have, an event. We did all of those things. We had a website, we had an event, we had infographics, we had animated videos, we had videos with people talking, all that stuff. But we tried to come at it a little bit more from an unusual direction. And then the other aspect of it, I would say, was really pushing back against some of these attacks and not being afraid to say, I was making sure every time one of these a post or a quote in an article or whatever was coming, accusing biofuels of being the worst thing ever, I was pushing back all the time, always being the first comment under a post, and saying, in effect, turning the argument around on its head. If you're an environmental NGO, why are you making an argument that is supporting fossil fuel? And a lot of times, I think there was a little bit of people were startled and got the message. And in the end, that campaign went on for about a year, and we did a lot of other things. It was by far the most expensive, I'd say, thing that my association has ever done. For 1 year, we I would say we tripled our usual communications budget for 1 year, and it was like we had to say to members, this is the time to do this. This requires something a bit extra, and they went along with it. So it took something extra, and we did things like Google search, paid for getting additional exposure in Google search and on YouTube, to targeted advertising around the EU. So it was a bit more than the usual Brussels bubble campaign. And in the end, it worked, I think. I mean, we weren't eliminated. In fact, you know, pretty soon the Fit for 55 is still going on, but the biofuels discussion has pretty much been settled, at least in terms of the Renewable Energy Directive. There's still a cap on how much can be used, but it's still allowed, and it's still recognized that we have a role to play. And it's an important role to play. And if they got rid of it, it would be bad news. There would be more fossil fuel and transport, which no one wants. So,
You said the campaign took about a year.
yeah.
So I'd like to ask if there was a moment where you had to adjust strategy, maybe regroup some of the tools, or did everything go as you planned for the
Uh,
entire year?
no, it didn't actually, because right after, almost simultaneously with our start, or after months of planning, was when Russia invaded Ukraine. I'm sure this affected a lot of other people, and obviously in the scope of things, it didn't mean much for us, but it did mean that the one of the things that came out of that awful news was that there was a big discussion about uh, uh, grain prices and whether there was going to be a famine. And a lot of this fed into some of the opposition to biofuels, saying that we were going to be causing a worldwide famine and affecting food prices, none of which happened, obviously, and completely ignoring, as I said before, the fact that we're actually producing food domestically, in addition to producing the fuel. So, you had we had a situation where we had to shift a bit, being mindful of the political reality, which it was, and obviously still is, something that's incredibly important and sensitive topic, but also saying, okay, there's a strategic role for us to play. The EU is trying to have energy independence from Russia. We want to have food security, obviously, and we had to sort of adjust, let's say, the campaign to make it clear that we were not going to make a bad situation worse, but we're actually going to make a significant strategic contribution to helping make it better. And so that was something that happened early on. After that, I don't think we really, I mean, that sort of dominated the discussion for a lot of it. But our key messages were pretty much still there. We just had to approach them a little differently, I would say.
Let's talk about alliances, because sometimes you're big and loud enough to speak for yourself, but sometimes when you are representing maybe a small industry, or maybe an industry or issue that is only relevant in a small part of the European Union, and we know that the topics that are EU-wide problems get more attention than anything else. What's your experience in building good alliances that involve more than one association, maybe some NGOs, or maybe what are the challenges you had in uh, building campaigns that have, involve just more than one organization?
Yeah, we're involved. I mean, I think I've got pretty good experience with that. We're involved with several different alliances of different sizes and scopes. Some of it is just some of it is informal and some of it is formal. There's a coalition, I would say, of associations that are in the EU. We call it the biofuels chain. So it's farmers and farmer cooperatives, oilseed producers, sugar producers, not just ethanol, but also the biodiesel, which is another type of biofuel. So that's one alliance that we're in, and we do a lot together. We do a lot publicly, open letters or joint statements. We've done published some op-eds with. It's one of those things where you see an op-ed and there's like 20 logos underneath it. But so we do that. We're also involved in some larger, more formal alliances like the European Bioeconomy Alliance, which includes all the different bio-based industries. So not just biofuels, but bioplastics, biotech, starch, as well as the primary products like farming products and things like this, which all feed into that. We're involved in an even bigger alliance called the European Net Zero Alliance, which includes a lot of different cross-sector associations. Um, and I mean, the bigger you get, the harder it is to move, and also you get. I think your messages become more general because you're starting to have to please a much broader range of voices. But it just depends. For certain things, I feel like it's helpful to have that. If you're making a kind of general call for something, it's helpful to have that. If you can get people to agree on a position and move on it fairly quickly, then it's good. Other times, I sometimes think I'd rather have a more compelling message just from us than spend a week trying to align others. It just depends. I don't really have a golden rule on that, but I just know there are some situations where getting agreement on something is going to take a bit longer. But just depends on the situation, really. I think it is important, obviously. you know um, Brussels is it's kind of, you have these things that are like alphabet soup of all these different acronyms and everything, and after a while it's like, okay, maybe that's too many. um, but if you're trying to get the attention of policymakers, and you can say, for instance, in the European Bioeconomy Alliance, there's so many industries there. It's representing like 20 million jobs in Europe. And, I think for policymakers, they can't really ignore that too easily, to say this is a big sector of the economy and we share a position on X, this, and this. It can be quite useful.
Especially in the long term, right?
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
Thinking about what you said about the campaign you described, that it consisted of so many different uh, tools. It had some guerrilla marketing activations. That's quite innovative. Still, I mean, there's been much evolvement in how communication is done in Brussels, but you still don't see that many, especially given that there are, if I'm not mistaken, 12,000 organizations registered in the transparency register.
Yeah,
You don't see that many campaigns of that sort that are digitally and also um, marketing wise innovative.
yeah.
And since you've been here in Brussels for 23 years,
Yes, correct. Yeah.
what would you say from your perspective, what changed for worse and what changed for the better in how comms works, and what is possible?
That's a really good question. I mean, in some ways, it's the same thing because everything moves so much faster now. That could be good or bad. You know what I mean? It was the same in journalism, really. Everything moves so much faster and it's instantaneous, but it also means you're chasing a lot of things that are instantaneous. And sometimes there is a need to say, wait a minute, let's get the real context, or let's think this through. I don't know, revolutionary thought. Let's think this through. Nowadays, it seems like no one ever thinks anything through. Which is a shame. But on the other hand, obviously there are, you know, one thing I would say that's changed for the better, um, is just the ability to be. There's so many tools that allow you to be creative. Um, you can make a video instantaneously, share it widely instantaneously. You don't have to have technical expertise or anything like that. It can be useful, and it oftentimes is useful, but you don't have to have it. Um, I would say I think there's still quite a ways to go. I'm talking about communications in general, and this is on the association side and certainly on in the whole EU bubble, in terms of making things clear and easy to understand. I mean, I think in the old days, and maybe still nowadays, a lot of communications is designed so that people don't understand because they don't want people to know what's going on, really. But I find that just annoying. You know, there needs to be, well, people who follow me on social media, on LinkedIn or on Twitter or what have you, know that I'm constantly on the warpath against jargon and BS and overlong convoluted statements, and you still see this everywhere. But I think a lot of people have gotten wise to it, and it's definitely gotten a lot better. And even as you see things coming out of the EU institutions, for example, are a lot more tech savvy, and not just tech savvy, because you can have the greatest technological tools. You can have the biggest budget for making videos anywhere. But if you don't have a clear message or something compelling to say, it doesn't matter how good your video is or how cool it looks or how much money you spent on it if it doesn't say anything. So for me, I'd rather have, you know, a quote that is pithy and direct, that says something, than a cool 1 minute video that's just a bunch of bells and whistles. So you have a lot more of that obviously than there used to be. I mean, when I first came to Brussels, they were barely, they had barely introduced English in the press room in the European Commission when I started here. So it's going back a ways. Um, but I think in general, people are getting a little bit more, I would say, not just tech savvy, but savvy about how to communicate clearly and compellingly.
So, if I get it right, you will agree with me that Brussels puts often too much emphasis on using hashtags and having a hashtag for everything, and actually trying to own the hashtag for even one-off events. What's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, hashtag, I don't even know. I mean, I use them and I come up with them, but they don't. I don't know. I don't know now how Twitter works. It may be that a hashtag ruins your algorithm. I have no idea, but it doesn't. Again, it's not going to save your industry. It's not going to get your message across. It may help file some tweets or whatever, um, but you've got to say we stand for this, or this. The EU needs to do this, or don't do this, or this will happen. And a lot of times there's way too much. Um, Throat clearing and confusing material around that stuff that just doesn't your message doesn't get through, and people get lost in the hashtag or the fact that you have breakout sessions at your event or what have you, and they forget, what is the thing we're trying to get across, what is the point we're trying to make. And if you can't get that across in the space of like one phone screen, then you're going to lose, unfortunately.
You said before that your past experience in journalism gives you this advantage of knowing journalists. So having a network that most people who come into comms have to build up. Um, and if there's any advice you could give to um, communicators, to public affairs professionals, how to be a good networker who wants to build relationships with journalists, where to start, and how to be a person that journalists want to be in touch with. If
That's
there's
good.
any secrets that you can
I,
share.
I'm not sure. Maybe I have an unfair advantage because I've worked there, but I would say, and I'm not a kind of compulsive networker. I'm not going to every event, and I'm not one of these people who is introducing myself to everyone at a function or a conference. It's just kind of not the way I'm wired. But what I do is I try to, I think you shouldn't be afraid of contacting journalists. And as I was saying earlier, it's important to be an honest broker and to reply quickly and to do a little bit of work to know what it is they're interested in. Um, I can remember as a journalist constantly if I'm covering I might be covering competition beat and someone's emailing me about something to do in fisheries or ag, uh, you know, then that's just going to make me angry. And some other time I might get that PR person trying to sell me on something else, and I'm going to be like, no, were spamming me before. So know what it is they want, and just kind of feed into that a little bit without being a pest. I may be an outlier on this because I know there are still schools of PR thought that are still very much call people on the phone repeatedly and don't be afraid to send 10 emails or whatever. But for me, it's like I'd rather make an initial contact and say, here's what you know, I, um, I'm new at the widget industry, and I know you're part of your job is covering widgets. If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. I'll get back to you immediately, and then follow through on that. You don't have to, you can ask for a coffee or whatever or meet up, but you don't have to force that issue. I think as long as a journalist knows you're available and you're going to answer their questions and you're not going to bullshit them, that's a good enough relationship right there. And also that you're not bothering them with thing, something that isn't news or isn't interesting. Like the fact that you had an event yesterday, maybe they don't care so much about. But if you have a new report that shows some really crazy thing about how uh, widgets are going to be 50% less in Europe thanks to some new policy, um, that that could be a news peg for them, then they're going to be interested. So you just have to know that and know when to, read the room and know when to raise your voice, I would say.
So be friendly, but not too much.
Yeah, I mean, like I say, there are people who, you can go and there are things around town where you go to events, and you'll meet journalists there. Although a lot of times they're not, you know, they have to be five places at once, so they're not often at these things. But you can go to things and meet them or whatever. But you don't have to be immediately like, I'm not one who does the hard sell. I'm much more like if I'm contacting you, it's gonna be for something that's really important. I'm not gonna contact you 10 times. Uh, I'm not gonna pester you, and that's just kind of the way I do it.
This is great advice. And I just have one more question,
Sure.
Craig. This is actually a question I ask quite often on the show. And my gut tells me that you have an interesting perspective on this. And that is how to keep a work life balance, how to just make sure that you're happy with what you do. Don't overwork yourself, and just live a good life in this quite busy industry that is not made for office hours. So yeah, what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, it's one of the reasons I'm not in journalism anymore, at least, because it was a bit trickier to juggle the work-life balance there. I know people can do it. For me, it was harder. I was not really able to separate myself from the 24-hour news cycle, and it was taking a toll on me personally. And I felt like as much as I loved being a journalist and loved working with journalists and was a news junkie and all of that, I wasn't, I had other things I wanted to do with my life and didn't want to be stressed out all the time. Uh, and in my new role, it's not like a vacation. Like you say, it's a busy job. There's a lot of work, but I do try to. I do try to create boundaries and switch things off. This is something I think it's important to be able to get away from work when it's not work hours. And I'm not averse to, if there's an extraordinary situation where you need to work late, super late or on a Friday night or over a weekend, I'll do it if it's, a few times a year or whatever. What I won't do is if it's all the time. And there was one. I remember one instance not too long ago, where there was a news development on a Friday night that we needed to respond to as an industry, and I think a lot of people would have let it slide until Monday. But I already had I was already kind of in relaxation mode on Friday night. But this came up. I called my boss. We got on making a statement immediately. We contacted a few journalists, got a statement to someone at a couple of the major papers, and they were surprised to hear from a trade association on Friday night, quite honestly. And they said, "This is great. I'm going to use this." We got in there, and my boss was like, "I'm sorry, this has ruined your Friday night. It's really great of you to do this." And I said, "Look, I'm kind of excited. I'll do it. I'll do it. I'm happy to do it if it's a occasional thing." But wasn't working 24/7 is I'm not gonna do. And I think I don't. Fortunately, no one in my current situation expects that, and I don't think anyone in any situation should expect that. You need to, like you say, a work-life balance. It's life. You need to have your family time and your personal time, and for me, it's music and cooking and riding my bike. So if I don't do those things, I'm not going to be good at my job. So that's what it comes down to.
And I think that also comes with experience. You don't know how important that is when you're starting your career.
True, true. And you can, some people they want to be, they want to pour everything, or if you've got a startup or whatever, and you're putting all of that into it, that's fine. But I do think it's dangerous if you ignore those other things. You really do have to have that.
So thank you very much for all these very practical insights, and I think this is the uh, best thought to finish with today, because it's all about having work that gives you satisfaction, but also using that as a platform to live a fulfilling life. And I couldn't agree more with that. Craig, thank you very much
Pleasure.
for
Thank
for
you.
your time today. Thank you everyone who listened to us. Craig Winneker, uh, Director of Communications of ePURE, was our guest today. So once again, thank you for your time, Craig. Was a pleasure to
Thank
speak
you.
with you, and thank you to everyone who listened to us and watched us.